Ethan Wallace pulled into the bustling parking lot of Riverway Market, scanning for an available space among the sea of cars. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, and the weekend rush was in full swing. Families and individuals hurriedly navigated the lot, their carts overflowing with groceries. Spotting a vacant spot near the entrance, a prized location on such a busy day, Ethan carefully eased his sedan into place, making sure it was neatly centered between the lines. Just as he opened the door to step out, the sharp screech of tires made him pause. Looking up, he saw a white SUV pull up aggressively next to him. Behind the wheel was a woman whose face was twisted in fury even before her window rolled down. "Hey," she barked, jabbing a finger toward him. "That was my spot." Ethan blinked, startled by the hostility in her tone. "Excuse me?" he replied, keeping his voice steady despite the confusion etched on his face. The woman, already stepping out of her car, slammed her door shut with a loud thud. She stormed toward him, her voice rising with each step. "I was waiting for that spot. I had my blinker on and everything." Ethan glanced around the lot. He hadn't noticed any cars waiting when he parked, and the lane had been clear. Taking a deep breath, he responded evenly, "I didn't see you. The spot was open when I got here." Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer as she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "Of course, you didn't see me. People like you never do you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she meant by "people like you." He'd heard this rhetoric before, seen situations spiral from minor inconveniences into something much uglier. Determined not to let it get to him, he maintained his composure. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sorry if you were waiting, but the spot was empty when I parked. I didn't cut anyone off." "Don't you talk to me like that," she snapped, her voice echoing across the lot. "I'm sick of people like you thinking you can do whatever you want. Entitled, disrespectful, thinking the rules don't apply to you." Ethan's hands balled into fists at his sides, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm just here to grab some groceries. I don't want any trouble. It's just a parking spot." His measured tone seemed to ignite something in her. Her face contorted with rage as she stepped closer, jabbing a finger at his chest. "Trouble? Oh, I'll give you trouble. People like you are nothing but trouble. You come into neighborhoods like this and ruin everything. I bet you don't even live around here." Ethan's temper flared, but he fought to keep his voice even. "Where I live has nothing to do with this." "Of course it does," she screamed, trembling with anger. "This is exactly what happens when people like you move into our communities. You think you can take whatever you want. I've had it with your kind." Her words stung, but Ethan refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. A few people in the parking lot had begun to stop and watch the scene unfold. He realized he needed to de-escalate the situation before it got worse. "I'm not doing this with you," he said, turning to walk toward the store. "You're upset over a parking spot, but it's not worth this." He had taken only a few steps when he felt a hard shove from behind. Stumbling forward, he managed to catch himself before hitting the ground. His heart pounded as he spun around to face her. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, the last shred of his patience gone. "You don't get to put your hands on me." The woman, whom Ethan had already mentally dubbed Denise, stood her ground, her chest heaving with fury. "Oh, I'll do whatever I want," she hissed. "You think you can just walk away from me? I'm not done with you yet." Ethan stepped back, trying to keep his composure. His mind raced with possible outcomes, each one worse than the last. People like Denise thrived on pushing others to the brink, knowing how easily they could play the victim if the situation escalated. Ethan knew he had to tread carefully, but the fire burning in her eyes made it clear this wasn't over. If this went any further, Ethan Wallace knew it would end badly for him. He had seen it play out too many times before, a black man defending himself, but somehow being painted as the aggressor in the eyes of everyone watching. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed her. "Ma'am, walk away before you do something you'll regret." The woman, Samantha Crane, as Ethan would later come to learn, sneered, her lip curling in disdain. "You don't tell me what to do, boy." The word hung in the air like a slap, its racist weight settling heavily between them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. This wasn't about a parking spot anymore. It was about control, about entitlement, about her belief that she could do and say whatever she wanted without consequence. His instincts told him to walk away, but her words and the shove still burned inside him. Before he could act, Samantha lashed out. Her hand swung fast and sharp, connecting with Ethan's face in a slap so loud it seemed to echo off the nearby cars. His head snapped to the side from the impact. The sting spread across his cheek, but it wasn't just the physical pain that struck him. It was the humiliation of being slapped in public, the spectacle she was making of him. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The slap wasn't just an act of physical aggression. It was a declaration, a message that she believed she could humiliate him without facing any repercussions. His muscles tensed, the fire inside him roaring to life. He knew what society expected of him, to absorb this, to walk away. But he couldn't. Not this time. Without thinking, Ethan raised his hand and slapped her back. His response wasn't as forceful as hers, but deliberate enough to send a message. The contact was firm but restrained, a controlled warning rather than retaliation. Samantha staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek in shock. For a moment, silence fell over the parking lot as she stared at Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then, like a storm breaking, she erupted. You hit me!" she screeched, her voice shrill and unhinged. "You animal! You're gonna pay for this! Do you know who I am? You think you can lay a hand on me? I'll ruin you." Her words spilled out in frantic bursts, each one louder and more erratic than the last. She flailed her arms like a child in the middle of a tantrum, her face turning an angry shade of crimson. Turning to the small group of bystanders that had gathered, she pointed a trembling finger at Ethan. "He assaulted me," she cried, her voice rising to a wail. "This thug thinks he can hit a woman. You all saw it, he's done." Ethan's heart raced as he felt the weight of every gaze settle on him. People were murmuring to one another, some pulling out their phones to record the chaos. He could see their judgment forming in real time. He had seen it before. How quickly perception could shift, how effortlessly someone like him could be cast as the villain in a situation he didn't create. He took a step back, forcing himself to stay composed. His voice was steady but cold. "You hit me first. I didn't want trouble." Samantha, clutching her cheek as though he'd delivered a knockout blow, hissed at him. She looked almost feral, her anger consuming her. "You're done," she snarled. "You hear me? Finished." Ethan had had enough. "I'm not doing this with you," he said firmly. "I'm done." Without waiting for her reply, he turned and walked toward the store. His cheek still stung, and his pulse thundered in his ears, but he refused to give her another moment of his energy. Behind him, Samantha's enraged screams continued, her words becoming less coherent with every passing second. "You're finished! Do you hear me? Finished!" she yelled, her voice piercing the air. Ethan didn't look back. The automatic doors of the store opened with a soft whoosh, and he stepped inside, leaving the chaos behind him. The cool air and subdued hum of the supermarket were a stark contrast to the madness in the parking lot. The soft murmur of shoppers and the faint sound of carts rolling across the floor felt almost surreal. He grabbed a cart, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handle, his chest still rising and falling with shallow breaths. As he moved down the aisles of Harborview Market, the altercation replayed in his mind, each word and gesture flashing before him like a relentless reel. The sting of Samantha Crane's slap lingered on his cheek, but the weight of her words cut far deeper. "Boy!" That venomous word echoed in his head, carrying the same ugliness he had faced so many times before. No matter how often these moments happened, they always hit him just as hard. He should have walked away earlier. He knew that. But it was always the same. People like Samantha acted as if they had the right to say and do whatever they wanted, convinced they could get away with it because of who they were. And because of what he was. It was exhausting. This constant battle between standing up for himself and trying to let things slide, all while knowing it might not make a difference in the end. What would the police have said if they had been called? Ethan shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside and focus on the reason he was here. Bread, milk, eggs, just the essentials. That was all he wanted. But as he reached for a loaf of bread, his hand paused midair, his mind dragging him back to the parking lot. Back to Samantha's snarling insults. Back to the moment she slapped him. Back to the crowd that had gathered, their eyes boring into him. He could feel the weight of their judgment even now, the subtle but unmistakable shift in their expressions when Samantha had screamed that he hit her. It didn't matter that she had struck him first. It didn't matter that his slap had been a restrained reaction, nothing like the force she had used. None of it mattered. It never did. Ethan forced himself to grab the loaf of bread and toss it into the cart. He moved to the next aisle, trying to concentrate on the task at hand, but as he walked, a deeper, colder anger settled into his chest. It wasn't the fiery rage that had flared during the argument. No, this was something different, something more familiar. This was the same anger he felt every time someone looked at him like he didn't belong. Every time he was judged, not for his actions but for his appearance. It wasn't just about a parking spot or even the slap. It was about the way Samantha had treated him from the moment she stepped out of her car. Like he was beneath her. Like he had no right to exist in the same space as her. Her words had been a slap long before her hand ever touched his face. Rounding the corner into another aisle, Ethan grabbed a carton of milk and dropped it into his cart with more force than necessary. He took a deep breath, the cool air of the store doing little to calm the heat simmering in his chest. This wasn't the first time he had faced something like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, for some reason, it felt heavier. Like Samantha's actions had cut deeper than others had before. Maybe it was the shove, or maybe it was the slap. Maybe it was the way she had made a spectacle of him, forcing him into a position where he couldn't win no matter what he did. The memory of slapping her back gnawed at him, not out of guilt, but because he knew how easily it could be turned against him. He hadn't hit her out of anger. It had been instinct, a reaction to her crossing a line. But Samantha knew how to play the role of the victim. She had twisted the narrative before, and she could do it again. As Ethan moved through the store, tossing items into his cart, he couldn't stop his thoughts from wandering. What if the roles had been reversed? What if he had been the one to initiate the argument? What if he had thrown the first slap? Would anyone have believed his side of the story? Would the crowd outside have watched him the same way, or would they have intervened immediately? By the time he reached the checkout line, his thoughts were still a storm of anger and frustration. The cashier greeted him with a polite smile, blissfully unaware of the turmoil churning inside him. Ethan nodded in response, forcing himself to stay in the present. He swiped his card, grabbed his bags, and headed for the exit. But the moment he stepped outside, the knot in his stomach tightened again. He could feel it, the weight of the confrontation still clinging to him like a shadow. As he walked back toward his car, he braced himself for what might come next. Ethan Wallace didn't want to return to his car. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach as he imagined what he might find. Was Samantha still there? Had she caused even more trouble? Something told him she wasn't the type to walk away quietly. As he approached the parking lot, Ethan spotted his car in the distance, and his heart sank. Even from afar, he could see that something wasn't right. His pace quickened, anxiety mounting with every step. When he got closer, the damage became unmistakably clear. Long, deep scratches marred the side of his vehicle, as if someone had dragged a key across the glossy paint with deliberate force. Ethan stopped in his tracks, staring at the damage. A wave of disbelief and anger washed over him, his fists clenching at his sides. This was no random act of vandalism. It was personal. It had to be Samantha. The scratches were fresh, and the timing was too convenient. She must have done this while he was inside the store, likely laughing to herself the entire time, thinking she had won. Ethan could almost hear her venomous, mocking voice in his head, taunting him. His anger surged hotter and sharper now. He walked over to the car and ran his fingers along the deep grooves, his chest tightening as he took in the extent of the damage. The quiet reflection he'd been wrestling with moments earlier evaporated. This wasn't just about her words anymore. Samantha had taken it further, crossing into something tangible, something that would cost him time and money to fix. Ethan glanced around the parking lot, half expecting to catch her lurking nearby, smugly gloating over her handiwork. But she was nowhere in sight. For a moment, he considered calling the police, but doubt crept in. He knew how easily Samantha could twist the narrative, playing the victim and painting him as the aggressor. There were no witnesses left to corroborate his story. Yet, something deep inside refused to let this go. He was tired of backing down, tired of letting people like her believe they could get away with behavior like this. Leaning against his car, Ethan stared at the scratches, his mind racing. He couldn't just let it slide. He wouldn't. 15 minutes passed as he stood there, waiting and thinking. Then, as if on cue, he heard laughter, a sharp, grating sound that sent a chill down his spine. Ethan looked up and spotted her. Samantha stood a few cars away, leaning against her white SUV with a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She had been watching him the whole time. "Oh, poor you," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like someone messed up your precious little car. Guess you shouldn't have taken my spot, huh?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. He straightened, locking eyes with her. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though his fury was barely contained. Samantha laughed again, louder this time, as if his frustration only amused her. "Oh, I think it's hilarious," she taunted. "And what are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Good luck with that. They'll just arrest you and take my side. You people never learn." Her words were gasoline on a fire. Ethan's blood boiled, his hands trembling as he fought the urge to lash out. He had never been one to let his temper get the better of him, but the temptation to wipe the smug look off her face was overwhelming. He took a step toward her, his lips parting to speak, but before he could say a word, she smirked again. "Go ahead," she said, taunting him. "Say something, I dare you." Ethan froze. He knew better. No matter what he said, it would only feed into her twisted game. Samantha wanted him to lose control, to give her more ammunition. He had to be smart, but then Samantha did something he didn't expect. She climbed into her SUV, still grinning at him through the open window. For a brief moment, Ethan thought she was finally leaving, but then, without warning, she threw the vehicle into reverse. The roar of the engine filled the air, and before Ethan could react, her SUV slammed backward into the front bumper of his car. The crunch of metal against metal echoed through the parking lot. Ethan's eyes widened in shock, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The back of Samantha's SUV had crumpled his car's front bumper, the damage undeniable. She sat there for a moment, looking back at him with a mocking grin, as if daring him to do something, then hitting the gas and speeding off, leaving him standing in stunned disbelief. The damage to his car was undeniable now. This wasn't just a petty argument anymore. It was outright war. Ethan reached for his phone, his hand trembling as he dialed. His chest felt tight, the weight of Samantha's words, actions, and sheer entitlement crushing him. He had tried to keep his composure, tried to walk away, but she just wouldn't stop. The crunch of her SUV slamming into his car replayed in his mind, amplifying his frustration. When the call connected, Ethan forced his voice to remain steady, even as anger simmered just below the surface. "I'd like to report an incident," he said, pausing briefly to take a calming breath. "A woman just deliberately hit my car and drove off. I'm following her now." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, asking him for details. Ethan quickly described Samantha's white SUV, its make, model, and license plate, and gave their current location. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, trailing her vehicle at a safe distance. The confrontation still raced through his veins, making his hands tremble. He knew he couldn't let her get away with this, but he also didn't want to provoke her further. The quiet suburban streets stretched ahead of them, and his mind raced along with his car. What if Samantha twisted the situation? What if the police believed her version of events? He'd seen it happen before, but this time it felt different. She had gone too far. This wasn't just about his pride anymore, it was about justice. She had escalated things far beyond insults or petty vandalism. Now, it was about holding her accountable. After a few tense minutes, Ethan saw the flashing lights of a police car up ahead. Relief washed over him as Samantha's SUV slowed and eventually pulled to the side at a red light. Ethan exhaled sharply, his pulse still racing, but at least now he wasn't alone. He parked a short distance behind her and stayed in his car for a moment, gathering himself. His hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, but there was no turning back now. He had made the call, and the officers were here. Ethan watched as the officers stepped out of their vehicle and approached Samantha's SUV. She didn't move at first, but then she began waving her arms frantically, shouting something. Even from his car, Ethan could tell she was agitated. Her voice, though muffled, carried unmistakably across the quiet street. She was already trying to paint herself as the victim. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of his car and walked toward the scene. The officers were at her window, speaking to her. Samantha pointed wildly in his direction, her face flushed with anger. "He hit me," she screamed, loud enough for Ethan to hear as he approached. "He attacked me, and now he's following me. Arrest him. I'm the one being harassed here." Ethan's stomach churned. This was exactly what he had feared. Samantha was twisting the story, turning herself into the victim. But this time, he wasn't going to let her narrative win. One of the officers, whose name tag read Officer Park, turned to face Ethan. His expression was calm and professional, unreadable. "What happened here, sir?" he asked, his tone steady. Ethan took another deep breath, steadying his voice even as his heart pounded in his chest. "I was in the parking lot at Harborview Market," he began. Samantha cut Ethan off, her voice shrill and frantic. "Lies! He's lying! He attacked me! He's dangerous!" Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. He turned to the officer, his tone calm but firm. "There are scratches on my car, officer. You can see the damage for yourself. And just now she reversed into me on purpose." Officer Park glanced toward Ethan's car, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the visible damage. "We'll take a look," he said, then turned back to Samantha. "Ma'am, please step out of the vehicle." Samantha's face flushed a deep red. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel, her frustration spilling out in venomous words. "You can't be serious? You're really going to believe him? Look at me. I'm the one who's been attacked. I demand you arrest him right now." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Officer Park repeated, his tone firm but professional. Her eyes darted toward Ethan, a mix of rage and disbelief flickering across her face. "You're doing this because of him, aren't you?" she spat, glaring at him with disdain. "This is all his fault. You people are all the same." Ethan bit the inside of his cheek, resisting the urge to respond. This was her game, pushing him, provoking him, trying to make him look like the aggressor. He wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Finally, Samantha threw her car door open and stepped out, her anger still radiating. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, gesturing wildly at the officers. "I'm not the criminal here. He should be in handcuffs." The officers remained calm, guiding her to the side and asking for her version of events. But Samantha didn't stop. She pointed at Ethan, her voice rising as she painted herself as the victim. "He attacked me. I was defending myself, and now he's stalking me. You're making a mistake." Ethan stood silently, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The accusations felt all too familiar. But this time he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one who knew the truth. Another officer, whose badge read Officer Alvarez, approached Ethan. "Can you walk me through what happened in detail?" he asked. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself before recounting everything. He described the escalating argument in the parking lot, the insults Samantha hurled, her physical shove, and the slap. He explained how she keyed his car while he was in the store, and then deliberately rammed into it before driving off. "Do you have any witnesses to the initial confrontation?" Officer Alvarez asked. Ethan shook his head. "There were people in the parking lot, but no one stepped in. I'm not sure if anyone recorded it." The officer nodded. "We'll check the store's security cameras to see if there's footage of what happened outside. As for the damage to your car, that's clear enough." Just as Officer Alvarez finished speaking, Samantha's voice rang out again, louder and angrier. "He's making this all up. You can't believe him over me. He's lying." Ethan tensed but didn't react as Officer Park returned, his expression serious yet measured. He turned to Samantha. "Ma'am," he began, "we have enough evidence to place you under arrest for property damage and assault. You'll need to come with us." Samantha's face darkened, her complexion turning crimson. Her whole body trembled as her rage reached its peak. "Arrest me? Are you out of your mind? He should be the one in handcuffs, not me," she screamed, jabbing a shaky finger toward Ethan. I'm the one who was attacked. Please turn around, ma'am, Officer Park repeated, stepping forward. Before he could finish, Samantha let out a piercing scream and lunged at Ethan. Her fists came down hard against his shoulder, the impact catching him off guard. Ethan stumbled back, stunned more by the sheer audacity of her attack in front of the officers than by the blow itself. You think you can ruin me? Samantha shrieked, swinging again. Her knuckles grazed Ethan's chest as her fury burned unchecked. Her face twisted into something feral and unrecognizable, her rage overtaking her. The officers quickly moved in, grabbing her arms before she could strike again. Samantha thrashed against their hold, her words spilling out in a venomous tirade. You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. You don't belong here. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding in his ears as the officers struggled to subdue her. Samantha kicked and flailed, her screams becoming incoherent as they wrestled her into handcuffs. I'm the victim, she shrieked, her voice cracking as they finally secured her wrists. Her wild thrashing slowed, but didn't stop entirely as they led her toward the police car. Ethan exhaled shakily, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline began to subside. Samantha's voice still rang in his ears, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of relief. She wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. She screamed, her voice cracking as they dragged her toward the squad car. You're all going to regret this. I'll have your jobs. You can't do this to me. Samantha Crane's shrill protests echoed through the parking lot, but Officer Park kept his grip steady on her arms, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault and property damage. We're done here, he said. Even as she was pushed into the back seat of the squad car, Samantha's voice grew hoarse and ragged. She twisted to glare at Ethan Wallace one last time, her eyes burning with hatred. You haven't won, she yelled, her voice muffled by the car's windows but still vicious. You'll see, I'll ruin you. Do you hear me? The car door slammed shut, cutting off her tirade. The police vehicle pulled away, its flashing lights reflecting off the shattered remnants of Ethan's composure. He stood there, breathless and shaken, his mind spinning from the events of the past hour. Officer Park approached him, his expression softening. Are you all right, sir? Ethan nodded, though his body still trembled from the adrenaline. His shoulder throbbed where Samantha had hit him, but it wasn't the physical pain that left him reeling. It was the sheer absurdity of what had just happened, the lengths Samantha had gone to in her rage, her blind entitlement. I'm fine, Ethan replied, though his voice was strained. Thank you, Officer Park said, handing him a business card. We'll get your statement on file. You can follow up at the station tomorrow if you want to press formal charges. I will, Ethan said, his words heavy with determination. As the officers left and the sound of sirens faded into the distance, Ethan stood alone beside his car. He stared at the deep scratches along its side and the dents in the bumper, stark reminders of Samantha's fury. But it wasn't just about the car. It wasn't just about the slap or the insults. This was about something bigger. About standing his ground, about refusing to let people like Samantha think they could get away with this kind of behavior. Ethan hadn't started this fight, but he was damn sure going to finish it. The next morning, Ethan walked into the Bay Ridge police station. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind, the tension in his chest still fresh, but the quiet hum of the station brought with it an unexpected sense of calm. He was here for one reason: to press charges against Samantha. He approached the front desk, where a young officer glanced up from her computer as he arrived. Her voice was professional yet kind as she asked, "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm here to press charges for an incident that happened yesterday," Ethan said, the weight of his words hitting him as he spoke. "There was an assault and property damage. I gave a statement yesterday, but I want to follow through with formal charges." The officer nodded and handed him a clipboard. "Fill this out with your information, and someone will assist you shortly." As Ethan sat in the waiting area, completing the paperwork, his mind wandered back to the confrontation with Samantha. Her screams, the blows she'd landed, and her relentless hate, it was all still raw, as if it had happened minutes ago. He couldn't help but imagine how differently things could have gone. If the officers hadn't arrived when they did, Samantha would have had no hesitation in twisting the story to suit her narrative. She had tried to do it anyway, even with witnesses present. But this time, the truth was out in the open. There was no hiding behind her privilege, no manipulating the situation to her advantage. Ethan had stayed calm when she lost control, and now the law had taken notice. "Mr. Wallace?" A voice broke through his thoughts. Ethan looked up to see Officer Park approaching. It was the same officer who had arrested Samantha the day before. Yes, that scent. The room was simple but functional, a desk, a few chairs, and a computer. Officer Park sat behind the desk, his fingers moving across the keyboard as he pulled up files related to the case. Ethan Wallace sat across from him, his posture tense but resolute. "So you've decided to press charges against Miss Crane?" Officer Park asked, glancing at Ethan briefly as he typed. Ethan nodded firmly. "Yes. Yet she needs to be held accountable for what she did." Officer Park leaned back in his chair, nodding in understanding. "I think you're making the right call. With the evidence we've gathered, the damage to your car, the witness statements, and her assault on you right in front of the officers, we've got a strong case against her." Hearing those words made everything feel more real. This wasn't just about a petty parking lot argument anymore. Samantha's actions had real consequences, and Ethan was determined to see it through. No matter how much she had screamed about ruining him, she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. As Officer Park continued typing up the report, the sound of a door slamming echoed from somewhere down the hallway. Ethan glanced toward the door, his attention momentarily diverted, but Officer Park's voice pulled him back. "We'll file this report and send it to the district attorney," Wad Park explained. "They'll review the charges and decide how to proceed with her case. But with everything we have, I don't see why they wouldn't move forward." Ethan nodded again, appreciating the officer's straightforwardness. After everything that had happened, hearing there was a clear path toward justice felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. A voice rang out from the hallway, loud and shrill, filled with unmistakable rage. Ethan's stomach tightened as he recognized it instantly. "You can't do this to me!" It was Samantha. The door to the small office burst open, and there she was, her face twisted in fury, her cheeks flushed a deep red. Her wild eyes locked onto Ethan as she wrestled against the grip of another officer. "You!" she shrieked, lunging forward. "You're trying to destroy my life. This is all your fault." The officer holding her quickly stepped in front of Ethan, blocking her path and restraining her further. But Samantha didn't relent. Her words came out like venom, her hatred palpable. "I'll sue you. You think you're gonna ruin me? I'll ruin you. You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." Ethan stood up instinctively, his heart racing. He stayed where he was, keeping his distance, but the intensity of Samantha's words made his pulse quicken. The officer holding Samantha looked at Officer Park and gave him a nod. Together, they pulled her back out of the room. Samantha's screams echoed down the hall as they dragged her away. "She's here for her arraignment," Officer Park said with a sigh, shaking his head. "I didn't expect her to be brought in this early." Ethan slowly sank back into his chair, trying to steady his nerves. Even in custody, Samantha was consumed by the same hatred and entitlement that had led her to attack him in the first place. "Don't worry," Officer Park said, noticing the tension in Ethan's expression. "She's not going anywhere. Once we finalize the charges, she'll be facing more than just an arraignment." Ethan nodded, though his thoughts continued to swirl. Samantha's words had cut deep, but he wasn't going to let her intimidate him. Not now, not after everything she'd done. "All right," Officer Park said, turning back to the computer. "We'll submit everything, and you'll be notified as the case moves forward. You did the right thing by coming in today." Ethan stood and shook Officer Park's hand. "Thank you. I appreciate everything you've done." "Just doing my job," Park replied with a small, reassuring smile. "Good luck with everything. We'll be in touch." As Ethan left the station, stepping into the cool morning air, a strange mixture of relief and resolve settled over him. He had taken the necessary steps. He had pressed charges and stood his ground. But he knew this wasn't over. There would be a trial, a confrontation in court, and he had no doubt Samantha would do everything she could to make good on her threats. Yet Ethan wasn't backing down. She might have underestimated him before, but not this time. Ethan Wallace had come too far to stop now. He would see this through to the end. Weeks had passed since that chaotic day in the parking lot, and now the trial was finally here. He sat quietly in the courtroom, his heart steady, but his thoughts a whirlwind. The room was tense, the quiet hum of anticipation filling the air. He glanced around. Rows of benches stretched across the room, the judge's bench looming above them all. A handful of onlookers were seated on either side, watching the scene with quiet interest. At the front, the prosecution team was making final preparations, while Samantha Crane sat at the defense table. Her face was pale, her jaw set in defiance. Samantha hadn't spoken to him since the incident, but the memory of her screaming and lunging at him was still vivid in Ethan's mind. Her wild eyes, her unrestrained rage, it was all as clear as if it had happened yesterday. Now, though, she sat stone-faced, staring ahead as though nothing was her fault, as though the chaos she had caused didn't exist. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the facts. This wasn't about emotions or the insults she had hurled at him. It wasn't even about the slap or the damage to his car. This was about accountability. Samantha had assaulted him, vandalized his property, and tried to manipulate the situation to her advantage. But now, everything was laid bare for the world to see. The sound of the door opening snapped Ethan's attention forward. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Margaret Hensley entered the room. Everyone stood as the judge, a stern, authoritative woman known for her fairness and no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat. Ethan had read about her. She had a reputation for cutting through emotional pleas and focusing solely on the facts. "Be seated," Judge Hensley said, her voice firm. The room fell into a hushed silence as everyone sat. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp and composed woman named Jessica Lane, laid out the charges against Samantha: assault, property damage, and disorderly conduct. Ethan listened intently as Lane spoke, her words precise and professional. "Mr. Wallace was simply trying to go about his day," Lane said, addressing the jury. "He did nothing to provoke this assault." Ms. Crane, on the other hand, escalated the situation. She not only damaged his property, but also physically assaulted him, twice, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, and even in the presence of law enforcement. "We are here today because Ms. Crane must be held accountable for her actions." When Lane finished, Samantha's lawyer stood. He was an older man with graying hair and a soothing, measured tone that seemed designed to appeal to the jury's emotions. "Miss Crane deeply regrets the events that transpired," he began, glancing at her. "She acted out of frustration, but she is not the criminal this case seeks to portray her as. She is a mother, a valued member of this community, and someone who had a bad day. A day that spiraled out of control." He paused, looking toward the jury as though pleading for their sympathy. "We ask you to consider the context of this situation, the pressure she was under, and to find compassion and understanding for what was, at its heart, an isolated incident." Ethan bit the inside of his cheek, the words stirring frustration inside him. Compassion. It was always the same. When people like Samantha made mistakes, the narrative was about finding empathy and understanding for the pressure they were under. But when people like him were involved, the focus was always on judgment. Samantha Crane sat down at the witness stand, adjusting her seat nervously. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her lawyer, Gerald Price, stood beside her, his tone gentle as he began his questioning. "Miss Crane," he started, his voice calm and measured, "can you describe what happened on the day of the incident?" Samantha let out a small sigh, lowering her gaze as if collecting herself. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I was having a terrible day," she began. "I went to the store, and when I saw the parking spot, I thought I could finally get a little break, but then Mr. Wallace pulled in out of nowhere and took it." She paused dramatically before continuing. "I got out of my car to confront him, and I regret what happened next." "And why do you regret it?" Price asked, leaning closer, his tone coaxing. "I regret losing my temper," Samantha replied, her voice trembling slightly. She looked toward the jury, her expression carefully crafted to evoke sympathy. "But what people don't understand is, Mr. Wallace slapped me too. I wasn't the only one who escalated things. He hit me right back." There it was, the twist Ethan had been expecting. Samantha, as always, was trying to portray herself as the victim, twisting the narrative as though his reaction equaled the violence she had initiated. Her lawyer nodded, giving her a sympathetic look before turning to the jury. "Miss Crane acknowledges her mistakes," he said, "but we cannot ignore the fact that Mr. Wallace also reacted physically. This was not a one-sided altercation." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the subtle sound of people whispering as the implication hung in the air. Price returned to his seat, leaving Samantha on the stand, and the prosecutor, Jessica Lane, rose with purpose, her sharp focus evident. "Miss Crane," Lane began, stepping forward with a steady, measured tone, "you claim that Mr. Wallace slapped you. But isn't it true that he only did so after you slapped him first?" Samantha shifted in her seat, her confidence faltering slightly. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly, "but he still hit me." "And isn't it also true," Lane continued, her tone pressing but controlled, "that Mr. Wallace's slap was not an aggressive or premeditated act, but a reflexive reaction in response to your attack?" Samantha hesitated, her eyes darting toward her lawyer, as though searching for a lifeline. "Answer the question, Miss Crane," Lane pressed, her voice firm but composed. Samantha's voice dropped as she replied, "I suppose it was a reaction, yes." Lane nodded, her expression remaining neutral but firm. "So, you admit that Mr. Wallace did not initiate physical violence, he merely reacted to being attacked." Before Samantha could respond further, Lane turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness to clarify the nature of the slap Miss Crane referred to." The judge nodded, and moments later a middle-aged man was sworn in and took the stand. Lane approached him with confidence. "Please state your name for the court," she instructed. "Jeffrey Caldwell," the man replied, glancing briefly at the jury before turning his attention back to Lane. "Mr. Caldwell, you were present in the parking lot on the day of the incident between Mr. Wallace and Miss Crane, correct?" "Yes, I saw the whole thing," Jeffrey confirmed. "Can you describe what you saw regarding the physical altercation?" Lane asked. Jeffrey nodded. "I saw Miss Crane approach Mr. Wallace. She was yelling at him pretty loudly. I couldn't hear every word, but it was clear she was upset. Then she pushed him, and when he didn't react, she slapped him across the face. Hard." The courtroom murmured again, but Jeffrey wasn't finished. "That's when Mr. Wallace slapped her back. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't aggressive. It seemed like he was just trying to stop her from hitting him again." Lane leaned in slightly. "Would you say Mr. Wallace's slap was a reaction rather than an attempt to escalate the situation?" "Absolutely," Jeffrey said without hesitation. "It was light. He didn't seem like he wanted to hurt her. It looked like a reflex, just to defend himself." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," Lane said, turning back toward the jury. "What we've heard from Mr. Caldwell, a neutral witness, confirms that Mr. Wallace's action was not an act of aggression, but a defensive response to Miss Crane's attack." Samantha's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of the testimony settling over the courtroom. Lane returned to her seat, the jury now visibly more engaged, processing the clear narrative shift. Samantha, still seated at the witness stand, glanced nervously toward her lawyer, her bravado beginning to crumble under the weight of the evidence. For the first time, it was clear the story she had spun was unraveling in front of her. The courtroom fell into a subdued murmur as Judge Hensley announced a short recess before closing arguments. Ethan Wallace stood, stretching his legs, feeling a complicated mix of anticipation and unease. It was almost over. Soon, the jury would decide whether Samantha Crane would face real consequences for her actions. Ethan tried to steady himself, knowing the importance of what was at stake. When court reconvened, the prosecution and defense delivered their final statements. Jessica Lane was sharp and precise, her arguments leaving no room for doubt. She laid out the facts with clarity, hammering home the point that Samantha's actions were intentional, calculated, and destructive. Samantha's lawyer, on the other hand, leaned heavily on emotional appeals. He asked the jury to consider the human side of Samantha's behavior, painting her as a woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. He implored them to see her as someone who made a mistake rather than a criminal. But Ethan knew better. This wasn't about bad days or emotional struggles. It was about accountability. It was about justice. Hours later, the jury returned to deliver their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the four persons stood, holding the paper that would determine Samantha's fate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Samantha Crane, guilty of assault and property damage." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Samantha's face paled, her composure finally breaking. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested in her lap, and she stared ahead, motionless. The weight of the verdict seemed to crush her. For the first time, the reality of her actions appeared to settle over her like an unbearable burden. Ethan exhaled slowly, relief washing over him in waves. It wasn't just about the verdict, it was about something bigger. He had stood up for himself, and shown that no matter how many people like Samantha tried to push him down, he would not be silenced. As the courtroom adjourned, Ethan rose from his seat with his head held high, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Justice had been served. The room buzzed with murmurs as people gathered their belongings and began to file out. Ethan remained still for a moment, letting the reality of the verdict sink in. Samantha had been found guilty. The weight he had carried since the moment she laid her hands on him in the parking lot began to lift. But as relief spread through him, a quieter, more unsettling thought lingered in the back of his mind. Yes, justice had been served, but the whole situation left a bitter taste in his mouth. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about what Samantha represented, her entitlement, her hatred, her belief that she could treat him as less than human simply because of the color of his skin. That wasn't something a courtroom verdict could fix. The thought stung deeper than the slap she had given him that day. As Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, a cool breeze brushed against his face. He paused on the steps, inhaling the fresh air deeply, hoping it might ease the heaviness in his chest. But it didn't. The verdict had brought closure to the legal side of things, but emotionally Ethan was far from at peace. Why did people like Samantha exist? The anger simmered beneath the surface, impossible to ignore. This entire ordeal, being yelled at, slapped, mocked, and attacked, had all stemmed from Samantha's deeply ingrained prejudice. She didn't see him as another person, but as someone she could degrade and abuse without consequence. And that kind of hatred wasn't rare. It was everywhere, woven into everyday interactions that were often too subtle to call out, but cut just as deeply. Ethan hated that people like Samantha walked through life so easily, spewing their venom without a second thought. The way she had acted during the trial, trying to paint herself as the victim while barely acknowledging the harm she had caused, sickened him. More than anything, it was a reminder of how widespread and insidious this kind of racism was. Ethan had grown up hearing stories like this, his parents, his uncles, and his friends all recounting moments when they had been treated as less than human. He had experienced it himself in subtler ways. The lingering stares, the occasional slurs, the quiet but unmistakable judgment. But this was something else entirely. Samantha had physically attacked him, and she had done it, as if she expected to get away with it. Ethan Wallace clenched his fists at the memory, the sting of Samantha Crane's slap lingering, not just on his face, but on his dignity. He had tried to walk away, tried to de-escalate the situation, and yet she had only pushed further, escalating it into chaos. It was people like Samantha who made it so exhausting to simply exist as a black man in America. No matter how calm, how polite, or how professional you were, there was always someone waiting to tear you down just because they could. Jessica Lane, the prosecutor, approached him then, her presence pulling him from the spiral of his thoughts. She gave him a small, knowing smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. Ethan shrugged slightly. "I guess I'm relieved," he said after a pause, "but I don't feel as victorious as I thought I would." Jessica nodded, her expression understanding. "That's completely normal. Court victories in cases like these can feel bittersweet. It's about more than just the verdict, isn't it?" Ethan nodded, letting out a slow breath. "Yeah, it's just people like her. They don't go away. Even after all this, Samantha probably still believes she did nothing wrong, and there are so many more like her out there. It's frustrating." His voice wavered slightly as he spoke, the pent-up frustration he'd been holding in threatening to spill over. Jessica's gaze softened. "I know. Unfortunately, people like her aren't rare and the system can only do so much. But what you did today matters, Ethan. Standing up for yourself matters." "I know," Ethan muttered, though the weight of it still didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ongoing battle he hadn't asked for. I just hate that it's still happening. That people like me have to keep fighting for something as basic as respect. I'm tired of it. Jessica nodded again, her voice quieter but no less firm. You're right to be tired. It's exhausting, but every time someone like you stands up and pushes back, it makes a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right away. Ethan managed a small, weary smile. Thanks for everything you did in there. I appreciate it. You're welcome, Jessica replied warmly. Take care of yourself, okay? And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. With that, she gave him a polite nod and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone on the courthouse steps. He took a deep breath and began walking toward his car. The very same car that had been at the center of the storm that day in the parking lot. The damage had been repaired, the scratches and dents replaced with smooth, glossy panels. Yet every time he saw the car, he couldn't help but think about that day. The scratches, the dents, they had been more than just physical damage. They were symbols of Samantha's entitlement and the ugliness of her actions. And even though the car looked brand new again, the memory lingered. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door behind him with a soft thud. He sat there in silence for a moment, catching his reflection in the rearview mirror. He stared at himself, really stared, and saw a man who looked weary. Weary of the fight to be treated like a human being. Weary of being seen as a threat or a target simply because of the color of his skin. This wasn't just about Samantha. She was a part of a much larger problem. Racism wasn't a rare, isolated event. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life. It showed up in subtle ways. The hesitation before someone sat next to him on the train, the way cashiers gave him suspicious looks when he paid with cash. And then it reared its head in blatant, violent ways, like Samantha slapping him in a parking lot and expecting to get away with it. His fists tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. And yet, this was the reality he had to navigate every single day. People like Samantha weren't going anywhere. They existed, walking through the world with their entitlement and venom, completely blind to the damage they caused. The weight of that truth pressed down on Ethan like a heavy stone. He hated that this was his reality. He hated that his skin color made him a target for people like her. And more than anything, he hated that he had to keep explaining why it was wrong, over and over again, to people who refused to see it. Ethan let out a long, heavy sigh as he started the car, the engine humming to life beneath him. Ethan Wallace let out a long breath as he pulled out of the courthouse parking lot. The city streets blurred past him, his mind churning with frustration and exhaustion. The trial was over, but the real battle, the fight against the ingrained racism that people like Samantha Crane carried with them, was far from finished. As he drove, a pang of sadness settled in his chest. He had won today, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt more like he had simply endured, survived another encounter in a long and exhausting series of battles. And deep down, he knew there would be more. People like Samantha didn't disappear after a guilty verdict. They resurfaced again and again in different forms and faces. Ethan pulled into his driveway, his body and mind worn down by the weight of it all. Turning off the engine, he sat in the quiet stillness of the car, staring out at the world beyond the windshield. Jessica Lane's words echoed faintly in his mind. Standing up for yourself matters. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was the only way to push back against the tide of people who carried Samantha's entitlement and hatred. But at that moment, all Ethan wanted was peace. To not have to fight, to not have to justify his existence, to simply be. Stepping out of the car, he shut the door gently behind him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft light over the neighborhood. He walked slowly toward his front door, his footsteps heavy with the lingering weight of the day. He tried to focus on the small sense of relief that came with knowing Samantha had been held accountable, that justice, however flawed, had been served. But the bitterness clung to him, a shadow that refused to lift. Ethan knew it would take time. Time to process everything, to let go of the anger that simmered just below the surface. The anger at a world where people like Samantha felt emboldened to act with such hate, and at a system that allowed it to persist. But for now, he told himself, he had done what he could. He had stood his ground. He had spoken the truth. And for now, that would have to be enough.